Good evening, everybody. Oh, thank you for waving back. Now I know that I'm not just speaking into the void. I appreciate that very much. My name is Roy Kesey. I'm the Associate Director at the Rose O'Neill Literary House. I'm joined tonight by our new Assistant Director, Amber Talianisic. Our director and esteemed leader, Dr. James Allen Hall, will be joining us shortly. I don't know about you. In honor of Bob, I will be having bourbon for dinner. I invite you to join me in that age-old tradition. More importantly, we are absolutely delighted that you are here to join us in remembering the singular storyteller and program builder and professor and author, Robert Day. We had an absolutely delightful event at the Lit House a few months ago for this very purpose. We were joined by Kathy Day and a large number of old friends and colleagues. But of course, doing it in person meant that only people within driving distance could come, and that didn't seem quite right. So we are very glad to see you, albeit virtually, here tonight. I'll start off with a few quick words about Bob, and then we will get to the main event, which is when all of you start telling your stories and sharing your memories of Bob. As most of you surely know, Bob Day was the founding director of the Rose O'Neill Literary House, and he was also its longest serving director. In his 27 years in the position, from 1970 to 1997, he turned Washington College into a literary powerhouse. The list of authors he brought here to speak and read to our students is breathtaking. Allen Ginsberg, Catherine Ann Porter, William Stafford, Toni Morrison, Joseph Brodsky, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Edward Albee, Billy Collins, William Kennedy, and many, many more, with Nobel Prize winners and Pulitzer Prize winners and National Book Award winners among them. Bob passed away on January 6th of this year, and since that day, we have been brainstorming ways to honor his legacy at the Lit House. He did more than anyone I know to send students out into the world prepared for its travails and challenges. And in that spirit, we are building a program called Light of Day. Get it? Day? You see that, right? Which will send Washington College students out into the publishing world to work at publishing houses, magazines, newspapers, literary agencies, and the like. Toward the end of tonight's event, we'll be sharing more about the Light of Day program and inviting you all to get involved in honoring Bob Day in that way. But for now, let's focus on the man and his legacy. As I said, Bob Day is the reason the Lit House exists at all. He convinced the college to acquire the house at 407 Washington Avenue and convert it into a literary house, a place where students would be encouraged to grow in their craft, to form essential writerly habits, and to build community with one another. The Lit House later moved to Richmond House and then to Dorchester House before finally finding its permanent home in October of 1985 in a beautiful Victorian given to the college by Betty Casey and named for Casey's mother-in-law, Rose O'Neill. Bob Day was himself a remarkable author, publishing several books, including the novel Let Us Imagine Lost Love, the memoir Chance Encounters of a Literary Kind, and my favorite, the novel, The Last Cattle Drive. He was also absolutely instrumental in a countless number of what were to become successful literary careers. As current Lit House director James Hall put it, any student who comes to the college because of the incredibly vibrant writing community at Washington College comes here because of the work that Bob Day, in collaboration with others, performed here. Any student who takes a print shop workshop class has Bob Day to thank as well, since he and Mike Kaler dreamed up that piece too. Now, the goal tonight is for all of you to share memories of Bob. We welcome you to read favorite passages from his books or articles or letters or emails. We also welcome you to tell stories of your encounters with Bob as a writer, a professor, or a friend. not to be selfish and greedy, but I'd like to start things off with a story of my own from back in 1991, the year I graduated from Washington College. Back then, I thought that I was smart enough to write poetry. Bob Day trained and encouraged literally hundreds of students to write poetry. As far as I know, I'm the only person he ever told to stop. Not in so many words, of course, but he was my thesis advisor. And one day I showed him a new lyric poem and he read it and had thoughts about it. And then he said, "Have you ever considered switching to narrative?" I thought he meant narrative poetry. He actually meant prose. And here I am 30 years later with 2 published novels and 2 collections of short stories and 2 guidebooks, all because he got me to stop trying to make things rhyme. So there's one to start us off. That is one of the many things I have to thank Bob Day for. I welcome all of you to join in now to keep it from becoming complete chaos, although Bob Day would probably think that was funny. Feel free to use the little blue hand feature if you have a story to share, or to raise your actual hand. And if I can figure out your real name from your screen name, I will call on you. Who's first? Who's got a story about Bob to tell?
So what are you doing here? Yeah, I got to find it first, though.
Tom Hawkins, you're first up.
The hand feature.
It's a short essay I wrote for. There was a literary house book put together a couple years ago, and I wrote this for it. It's only about 1,000 words, but definitely features Bob Day. It's called An Affair to Remember. Although poetry anthologies often include an index of first lines, it is the last line that I remember. My God, whose world is this? The poem was What I'd Like to Know Is by Kenneth Patchett, and it was nailed to the left of the toilet, assuming you were seated, on the ground floor of Washington College's O'Neill Literary House. Kevin and I met at orientation weekend. In our minds, there was no questions whose world it was. We were freshmen, eager to establish our identities at the place where we would spend the next 4 years of our lives. We were the co-hosts of a weekly column for The Elm, the student newspaper, in which we pestered local merchants for discounts for college students and made frequent cameo appearances in each other's creative works. By Parents' Weekend in October, we decided to take the next step, to introduce our mothers. To mark the occasion, we decided to show them what we'd accomplished in our first weeks of college. Our mothers sat uncomfortably on my dorm room bed as the tape began to play on the 11-inch screen of my combination TV VCR. Fade in. 2 stuffed bears. A rather stiff, small white bear and a plush, grinning brown bear approached each other. They began to kiss. They made out. They had hot, moaning sex in many different positions. Then they smoked cigarettes. Fade out. That neither mother was surprised was a testament that we'd broken them in properly.
Mm-hmm.
Officially, the movie was titled Death to Our Toys Part 1, Sunshine and Round Boy, An Affair to Remember. But later, it became known simply as Bear Sex. It was a truly collaborative effort. Kevin was an auteur, but I was the guy with the AV equipment. Our first step in the production process took place in the back room of the Chestertown Movie King, where we selected a pornographic movie for research purposes. We found one about a woman who gets locked out of her apartment in a towel, and while waiting at her neighbors for a locksmith, he spills coffee on her, she jumps up, the towel falls off, and they have sex on the creaky kitchen table. I imagine they later got married. We studied camera angles and lifted the audio track. Kevin went to the second floor of Caroline Hall to cast the film. He came downstairs with our stars and a promise he would show their owners later what we were doing with their stuffed bears. Kevin shot the video on my 1988 GE video camera while I moved the bears. They weren't puppets, so we had to keep my hands out of frame. Kevin's roommate, Jason, who was trying to finish a paper, occasionally looked over and gave us advice based on his own experiences. No, the brown bear is too far up on the white one. I hoped he would someday add this to his resume. In some of the shots, my head is unavoidably visible, but masked with a pillowcase. Now we just needed an audience. The O'Neill Literary House was a point of intersection for drama geeks, student journalists, artists and poets, drawn by the casual atmosphere, the parties, fueled not by beer, but coffee and a contact high from printer's ink, and the promise of the Sophie Kerr, a cash prize to the graduating student with the most promise in literary endeavors, whatever that meant. It was there Kevin and I decided to premiere our film at the 1994 Freshman Literary Colloquy. The Colloquy was a freshman tradition at Washington College, a curated formal reading of works following a selected theme. The theme selected for 1994 was the beat influence. It was in influence where we saw our opportunity. Who could argue anything in the latter half of the 20th century had not been somehow influenced by the beat generation? Surely at least Burroughs or Bukowski would have approved of our work. To mask our bald attempt to hijack the event for our own purposes, we infiltrated the Colloquy committee and convinced them to add the words, a multimedia presentation to the posters, promising we would deliver a video to accompany a reading. Somehow though, just days before the event, news of our plan leaked, and one student objected. Her grandmother was coming to hear her read, and there was no way she would subject her family matriarch to our version of art. We had to call in the big man upstairs to settle the dispute. Professor Bob Day, the Literary House sage, showed no hint of shock when we explained the situation. Clearly, he too, like our mothers, had been broken in properly. We each argued our respective positions. Art! Grandmother! I could tell he enjoyed being the only person in the entire universe to whom all parties in this case would listen and obey. He sighed and then quickly, as if he'd encountered the same situation a dozen times before, suggested a compromise. We could show the video, but muted. With the volume up, he reasoned, who could hear the readers? It would be too much of a distraction. Even without the soundtrack, I doubt there's anyone who remembers what was read that Sunday afternoon. Certainly there was some Kerouac and Ginsberg, Burrs and Bukowski, but no one came for the beat generation. They came to watch, in the worlds of the elm writer who covered the event, two unbelievably animate stuffed bears performing various sexual acts. This was our world, Kevin's and mine, at least for that afternoon. Kenneth Patchen was right, though, to question its ownership from his perch next to the ground floor toilet. The O'Neill Literary House yielded to no permanent authority, poet or printer, essayist or novelist. Our fellow student's grandmother didn't come to the reading. I'm not even sure she was real. Although Kevin and I continued to collaborate, there was no Death Through Our Toys Part 2. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, sex versus grandmother seems like a little bit of a false dichotomy, but I guess you never know. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I welcome all of you to applaud for real and or using the applause function. I also welcome you to have a look at the chat where we'll be putting up links from time to time. There is one up there now of the collection of essays, memories of Bob that Jim Doucette collected. Thank you, Jim, for that. So glad to see you here tonight. And also a link to one of Bob's books. All right, next up we have Perry Schwartz. Take it away. Go ahead and turn your microphone on first.
Okay, now you can hear me now.
There we go.
Okay, well, I have a little bit longer thing I've written. It's about 2,000 words, so I hope you bear with me. And I guess I'll just start reading it rather than tell those of you who don't have any idea who I am. This will kind of explain it, my tribute to Bob. So here we go. I first met Bob Day in the fall of 1965 when we both started teaching at Fort Hays, Kansas State College, now Fort Hays University. Bob taught in the English department, where his specialty was creative writing and more specifically poetry. I taught speech and drama and was the director of theater. In the first couple of years, we knew each other fairly well, but it wasn't really until the last 2 years that Bob and I became close friends. This was partly because in the summertime, both of us had to find additional work beyond our college teaching because our teaching salary was pretty low. So in the summer, I went off to Quincy, Illinois to direct and design in their community theater. Bob, in the summertime, worked on a ranch and learned how to become a ranch hand cowboy. It was because of that experience working as a ranch hand that he got the idea for his first novel, The Last Cattle Drive. As I remember, the story goes that Bob and Ward Sullivan, the rancher Bob worked for, were having tomato beer in the Brass Rail, a local tavern. Ward was complaining about the cost of shipping cattle from Hays to Kansas City via truck. So after several tomato beers, Ward declared that he was going to drive the cattle to Kansas City starting the next day. Once Ward sobered up the next day, he put the cattle on the truck to Kansas City. Bob, on the other hand, took this idea and turned it into his first novel. In the summer before our last year teaching at Fort Hays, Bob came to me with an idea for a play. I said, terrific, write it and I'll produce it. In the spring, when we both knew would be our last semester at the college. The play turned out to be No Negro Problem in Hays, for which Bob got fired. I had already decided to go to Ohio University and work on my MFA in theater direction and filmmaking. Because we worked closely together on creating No Negro Problem in Hays, we became close friends. During the time we were rehearsing this play, a rumor was floating around the campus and the city newspaper that No Negro Problem in Hays would involve nudity, which it didn't. That got the administration all fired up, and they tried to stop the production. I screamed academic freedom to everyone who would listen. So the administration, I could do the play, but could not pay for advertising. All the performances were sold out. It turned out that Bob had started the nudity rumor. That's typical of Bob. The spring of our last year teaching at Fort Hays, Bob was working on Ward's ranch, riding his horse to herd some cattle, and rode too close to a fence. The horse turned sharply away from the fence. Bob fell off and broke his arm. His arm was in his cast when he was getting ready to pack up all his belongings in a U-Haul truck and head off to the University of Arkansas to start his MFA. So the last thing we did together in Hays, along with several other students, was pack up the truck. My last memory of him in those days was him driving off in the truck with one hand because of his cast on the other. For the next 2 years, we were both in separate MFA programs. We didn't have much contact. Bob was always a sort of out of sight, out of mind guy. He wasn't much of a letter writer, and later, as the internet came to be, not much of an email user. His emails usually consisted of a sentence fragment that would suggest the idea he wanted to convey, which usually was some sort of plan to get together or to talk on the phone. The phone was another thing he really never got quite used to because he always thought it was very expensive. This was true even when he had a cell phone, which he never knew the number of. So he could never tell you how to contact him. That was very typical of Bob and somewhat endearing or annoying, depending upon how much you liked him. He was in many ways truly a character. I always liked that character a lot. I liked his quirkiness, his individuality. Some did not. After the time in grad school, Bob got his job at Washington College in Chestertown. In between completing my MFA, I spent a year in St. Leo College in Dade City, Florida. As fate would have it, in August 1970, after I completed my studies at Ohio University, 3 days before I was to head back to my parents' basement with my family, I received a call from Bowie State College in Maryland. They hired me on the spot when I visited them. Now Bob and I were once again only a short drive away from each other. This would remain that way for the rest of our teaching careers. Because of that close proximity, we once again would spend time together. Most of the time I would go to Chestertown to visit Bob, and we would set off on various adventures on the Eastern Shore. Bob had a very Midwestern work ethic, so whenever we got together, whether it was at my home or his, we would have to have a project to do. Sometimes that activity involved physical work, and sometimes just a drive to someplace to pick up something or put it back in the back of his truck, and then head back to his home or mine with that something. He called that male bonding. He liked to name things. Stoves had names, chainsaws had names, and of course, so did his dogs. He always had a dog, even at Fort Hays. The first one was a mutt that ran around the campus loose all the time, but everyone knew it was Bob's dog, so it was treated pretty well and probably fed way too much bad stuff by students and faculty who treated the dog like it was theirs, including me. Over the years, he moved on to purebreds, and that breed he chose was all Labrador retrievers. His last was a yellow lab whose name was Lullaby. He loved all his dogs, but he loved Lullaby the most. A lot of his dogs were hunting dogs, sent off for weeks to be trained to hunt and retrieve, but Lullaby was not. She was just a big, sweet, lovely lapdog. And if you know how big a Labrador is, it's a lot of lapdog. Also part of his Midwestern ethic was frugality. He saved soap slivers, and once he had enough of them, would press them together to make
Robert J.
Pardon me. Put enough of them together to make a bar of soap. He rarely would eat at a restaurant because it was cheaper to cook at home, and leftovers were a regular part of any meal. Sometimes a combination of several leftovers to make a new main meal. But on the other hand, he always had good and often expensive bottle of wine and with those leftovers. This quirkiness was also part of his charm. He loved to tell stories about people he knew. The stories started out with a kernel of truth, but because he was a fiction writer, the story strays from the actual truth even more than just a little. A story he told about me leaving Kansas after teaching in Western Kansas for 4 years is a good example. The reality was that when my family and I crossed the border into Missouri, I turned to my then wife and declared I would never come back to Kansas again. Bob's version of that story was I stopped the car, got out, and we had a picnic lunch complete with a bottle of wine and toasted my declaration of freedom from Kansas. He told this story to friends of his as he introduced me to them. His version, not the reality. I finally just smiled and nodded as if it were the true story. During the time that we both lived on the East Coast, Bob maintained a residence in Kansas. The residence was initially a cabin on Ward Sullivan's ranch, but eventually a house in Ludell, Kansas. Ludell is in far northwestern Kansas, and so literally halfway between Kansas City and Denver. As the distance was a great deal, I could feel the change as I drove across either the east coast of Kansas or returning to Kansas. I'm sorry, I bungled that up. I came into liking that return and eventually saw why Bob liked Kansas so much. Bob and I spent almost 40 years following this routine, and we both taught over those years at our separate college. During that time, I was directing theater at Montgomery College in Maryland. I produced 2 adaptations of Bob's writing. The first was called Fishing, which was an adaptation of the short story, The Story I'm Pitching. The second production was a Reader's Theater production of several short stories. And the title of that was Notes on the Cold War in Kansas, which was also a short story Bob wrote. The last 10 years he only taught 1 semester a year. So our time together was pretty limited. We still managed to do our weekends where we visited each other here in Maryland. But in the semester he wasn't working, much of that time was spent in France, where he and his wife had a house they rented in rural France. Bob loved France and thoroughly enjoyed the time he spent there. I think it would have been, if it would have been possible, he would have lived there full time. But instead, he bought the house in Ludell. During that 10-year period, I visited him there a couple of times, and a result of one of those visits was a short film called Kansas Peaches, in which Bob plays the male lead. The film actually came from a series of photographs I had taken in a previous visit. Bob wrote super short stories for each of those photographs, and I used those short stories as the basis of Kansas Peaches. After that 10-year period, he taught full-time for a couple of years more at Washington College. And during that time, he and Kathy, his wife, bought a house in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Eventually, he decided to stop teaching and live on his retirement income. For a couple of years, they lived between the three houses: Chestertown, Maryland, Ludell, Kansas, and Santa Fe. Finally, they decided to sell the Chestertown house and live in the West. So the last time I really spent any time with him, Kathy was living permanently in Santa Fe, and Bob was left to packing up the remainder of their belongings in their Chestertown home, loading up a truck and driving to Ludell with their belongings. Once again, I helped him load up the truck and saw him disappear to a new location far away from where we had spent so much time together, male bonding and building our friendship. I felt by this time that Bob and I were as close to being brothers as two people could be. That was about 5 years ago, maybe more. During that time, we have only had a very brief contact over the internet, maybe talked on the phone 3 or 4 times at most. He never became comfortable communicating via phone or internet, except to send me writing excerpts of pieces he was working on or to get my thoughts. When that writing turned into a book or a story, I would get a copy. But our relationship never returned to the great friendship and close communication we had had when we lived within an hour's drive from each other. During the last 5 years, I was never able to get to Western Kansas to visit Bob because of COVID. I knew he was in some decline over those years, but because I didn't see him, I didn't realize how much physical and mental decline he was in. So when he finally died in January of this year, 2022, I was shocked. I think of him all the time and still miss him a lot. Occasionally, I still talk to him. I think that would please him.
Thank you very much, Perry. That was moving. One of the great things that I loved about Bob was his ability to spot the single salient detail. And I think Frankie Rollins nailed it in the chat. It was the red beer. Hi, Frankie. It's good to see you. How are you? All right. Thank you again, Perry. Next up, we have Catherine Quillman.
I mute myself. I'm just going to read this short piece. Remembering Bob Day. I was never late to class, but my memories of Mr. Day, as I called him, in the classroom always had him sitting down, never en route. He sits near the bank of open windows of the William Smith Hall, giving the greenery outside as much attention as he does us, the students in his short story class. Day often sat the way Hemingway might have, casually in a cafe chair, his feet stretched out in front of him with his boots crossed at the ankles. In this classroom without a clock, he would begin, much like his favorite stories did, in media res. And often before we had a chance to grab the mimeograph paper being passed around the room. Scanning the sheet, smelling of that awful ink, we would see it as another story Day was referencing. Then reading further, we would think, no, this is not the story he is talking about, but it has a similar mood and style. Why was it important? We're supposed to read it now or later. Whoever it was, we learned it was good writing. This may be difficult for alumni who never knew Day to understand, but he taught us about the indirect narrative and other features of descriptive writing that, to use the so-called, or the talk of the town, that we only later realized was his style of teaching as well. Speaking of we, until Day, I never before learned about such important writing elements as POV or point of view, the omniscient narrative, and to make something really complicated, the third person limited view. Outside the classroom narrator personified. Might be about the distant past or maybe something that just happened on campus, but it was often a story about himself in relation to his friends and colleagues. The story seemed plausible, but then its ironic ending and mythical overtones made us wonder about the percentage of truth. This coming from a cowboy who had a crabbing boat made of cypress, wore baseball caps with cowboy shirts with snaps instead of buttons, and had a black lab named Amos. Day claimed to have a horse too, but we never saw it. I suppose now it was back in Kansas. I see now Day with his teeth seemingly clenched, blinking his eyes as if he was registering the experience in his memory bank. So let me continue to dispense with the royal we and touch upon what Day meant to me. I've always wanted to be a writer, but Day's automatic acceptance to me as a writer may be the writer today. Like Hemingway, Day believed that nothing is wasted on a true writer. Therefore, one should live their own life and do things, or you might be a writer has nothing to say, no stories to tell. Day also suggested that writers often struggled with jealousy, but that was a useless emotion and one might as well chew gravel because no writer has the same perspective or has the same experiences as a fellow writer. I gathered this because Day thought nothing of sharing his books, his off-duty time, and his IBM selective typewriter. For those who don't know, that typewriter was truly the professional artist tool in the late 1960s and early 80s. I know there's a lot more to say about Mr. Day. I especially wanted to reference an earlier passage so that I could bring up another favorite technique that Day often cited. He liked nothing better than to point out Chekhov's gun over the mantelpiece rule. To quote a Google definition, the rule states that every element in a story must be necessary and irrelevant elements should be removed. Funny, it was not a rule that Day seemed to practice with his own stories, but maybe I missed something.
That was lovely, Catherine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I remember that typewriter as well. He made it sing. Thank you for sharing that. Next up, we have Drew Gruenberg.
Yes, hi. I came to Washington College in the fall of 1972, graduated in 76. And when I came, I don't remember the circumstances, but I had 2 English classes my first semester. And one was with, if any of you remember him, Nicholas Newland, who was sort of the stereotypical professor that in my freshman sensibilities, he was all tweed and pipe smoking and the whole bit. And the second was Bob Day. And they couldn't have been 2 different people and 2 different personalities. And Nicholas Newland ended up retiring, I think, of maybe my second year there. And I had classes, I think, just about every semester with Bob Day, even though I was not part of the literary house and part of the literary scene. I was an American Studies major, but I used a lot of the courses I took with him for credits in American Studies. But one episode I wanted to relate was, or to share was, we were, I don't know what year it was, but we were in class in late November, and he was late to the class. So the classroom was chattering and talking. And about 10 minutes after the class was supposed to begin, you could hear his boots on the floor of Bill Smith Hall. And he came into the classroom. He sat down at a table and he reached into his sport coat and he pulled out a small paperback book and he started reading. And he proceeded to read Truman Capote's A Christmas Memory to the class. And when he finished, he just said, "Class dismissed," and walked out. And it was one of the most memorable classes I had at Washington College, I think, just because it was so different and so unique. And it had a huge impact on me because I ended up reading that story to my family for the next 30 Christmases in a row. And maybe about 15 years after I had graduated, I sent him a thank you note just for exposing me to good writing and good literature. And we then started an email friendship that went back and forth for about another 15 years. I ended up seeing him just one time in Washington, D.C. at the National Portrait Gallery when he gave a talk. But in one of those, he would periodically mail me things that he had written or things that he thought that I would be interested in. At one time, a small little package came in the mail and I opened it up and there was this little note and he said, "This is the very book." And it was the paperback book that he had pulled out of his sport coat and read from that day. I still have it. It's on my desk. So I just wanted to share that story, and it's a good example of the impact that he had on my life from the perspective of appreciating good writing and good literature.
Drew, thank you so much. That is a terrific story. And I love that it shows, it's one thing to be great in the classroom, right? It's another thing to build these relationships and to sustain them over time. And Bob was incredibly good at that. And I think many of us are the better for it. Thank you, Drew, for sharing that. The next hand up, Maria Wood.
Hi, thank you for inviting me and for having this. My grandmother was Mary Wood, and she was a student of Bob Day's when she went to Washington College as what we now call a non-traditional age student. And they became just great, good friends. And my memories of Bob are really not my own. And to the extent that they are, they're mostly just a grumpy guy in my grandmother's living room when they were having fun together and didn't really need a sullen teenager sloping around and being irritable. So I can't really share personal stories of Bob, but I did tell James that I would look and see. We have a whole shelf in this house of books by Bob Day that belonged to my grandmother. And I said that I would look and see if there was a good inscription in any of them. Sadly, I couldn't really read the handwriting on any of the inscriptions. The entire shelf is full of books that he's signed and written what I'm sure are very heartfelt and personal messages, but I really had a hard time interpreting them. I did find this lovely little, basically kind of a chapbook of poetry. And I thought that I would read one of the short poems from that. And as I was leafing through, I came to the last page, which I don't know if you're going to be able to read it, but it tells, is that better? It tells that it was printed at the Literary House by Mike Taylor, etc. And it says in an edition of 100, this is number 100. And Bob has circled that 100 and written, Mary, get this far so we can all approve. So that's the only one I could actually make out of the inscriptions, and it did seem to be characteristic. And so I'd just like to read this short poem called Fairleigh Creek. We have driven along the bank, following Fairleigh Creek to the bay. It is cold for April. Ahead, a knot of fishermen hunker. Among their shacks, fixing lines, nets hang from trees. Caleb Bingham's boats float on still water. It runs deep here. We stop. The fishermen stare. We film them, catching silhouettes with quaint techniques, trapping mood with lighting. They stare. We hear our engine idling. We should have come by water. And that poem captures a lot to me about the Eastern Shore, about my grandmother, about the relationship that the two of them had. And so thank you for letting me share it.
Mariah, thank you so much. My apologies for mispronouncing your name. And Mary Wood, as in the Mary Wood, right? The Mary Wood of the reading room in the Lit House, a place where students come to, well, over the past month or so, it's been mainly to enjoy the air conditioning, but also to study, to read, to build their identity as writers, to build community as writers. It is a remarkable space within the Lit House. I imagine most of you have enjoyed it. I welcome all of you to come and see it. Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you for that excellent reading of that poem and the sight of his handwriting, which is delightful. I guess we now understand why he needed that typewriter more than anything else. Thank you, Mariah. That was great. Next up, we have Lisa Nichols.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. Many of these faces I know, and that's kind of amazing and great. Yeah, I haven't prepared anything in particular, but I've been thinking about Bob or Mr. Day over the last several days and this summer. And I remember that at the beginning of my experience with him, I thought that was what was going to make him so appealing was all this outside the classroom stuff. How he was connecting with students in, what seemed like the real life part of our lives on campus. I remember in particular, fairly early in my freshman year, seeing him, I guess you couldn't really call it leading a game of academic football, but he was out there among a bunch of people running around with these junior and senior writers that I already knew I admired greatly because they were like the upper class people who, oh, they're so cool, and I thought, oh yeah, this is someone who's different. He's not like these other professors here, and there were a number of occasions like that, little things outside of the classroom. But the more I've thought about him lately, it's really been in those writing workshops. That's the things I keep catching myself telling other people about. I was just telling someone the other day how we had a workshop that started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And of course, he wasn't going to turn the lights on. He called it an organic, kind of lighting plan. So we would just go with whatever light was present in the room. And if the days were getting shorter, the workshop might get shorter. If they were getting longer, it might get longer. If it was a gloomy, rainy day, that would come into those windows, those great old runny glass windows in Bill Smith. And so even little things like that about how he ran that classroom that ostensibly didn't have anything to do with the actual, teaching part of it, influenced the atmospherics. And I also suddenly remembered listening to Catherine talk how he had basically ordered us to go ahead and call ourselves writers. There was none of this mamby-pamby, am I a writer? We were just basically told we were going to be calling ourselves writers, and it took all the pressure off of that. And it was like, all right, now let's get down to business. And I don't know, there were so many things in those workshops. And not too long ago, I was talking to someone about getting two first names confused that started with the same letter. And it reminded me how he told us in a short story, you shouldn't have two characters whose names start with the same letter because the story's not long enough for your readers to know the difference between the two of them. By the time they've really figured it out, the story's over. And there are just a lot of little ways that moments of him, both as a teacher and as this odd character out of the classroom, come back to me. But the main thing I think is that there was something about his presence that really brought together this kind of semi-cohesive sense of a literary community at that little college. Yeah, I never got all that close to him personally, although I was delighted whenever I got to spend some time, with cheese and crackers and wine with him or something like that. But it was a real pivotal part of my kind of coming into myself as a young person and embracing my own quirkiness. So I'm sure I could talk for 45 minutes, but I think that's enough from me. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Lisa, thank you so much. That was a great story. Yeah, he had a really remarkable ability to create a sense, not just of community among students, but of identity within individuals, right? And obliging you to take on this identity that maybe you're not even sure you have yet or deserve yet or have fully embodied. Naming it for ourselves helps us get there, doesn't it? Lovely story. Thank you. Next is Denise Joyal.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's either. It's whatever you want it to be, right? I was Denise O'Connell, graduated in 90. So that's my married name now. So I took freshman creative writing with Bob Day, and I was an art major, so I didn't have a lot of other opportunities to have classes with him, but I did work in the literary house. I did work study there. And so I helped Mike Kaler put away letters and, help people with the computers there and the printers if they got broken and that sort of thing. But I do remember an occasion in class where Bob Day would say, I don't know what's wrong with kids these days. You're never going to see any student, before 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning on campus. And so I was taking a drawing class with Sue Tessum, and I would often go over to the art house and just kind of get lost in the drawing and be there all night. And so it was a Friday night, and I will admit that my usual Friday night was probably, at a keg party and not in the art house, but that particular Friday it had been. And I found that it was 6 a.m. and I was leaving, and there's Bob Day with Amos in the middle of campus. And I yell halfway across the campus, "Hey, Bob Day, it's 6 a.m. and here I am." And he pauses for a minute and he just looks at me and he says, "Denise, you can't fool me. You've been out all night." So that's one of my favorite little Bob Day anecdotes.
Very nice. Yeah, he was surprisingly astute even at that time of the morning.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Remarkable. Thank you very much for that. Next up, we have Eva Miller.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see everybody. I didn't have time, or I didn't get a chance to prepare something formal, but I have a few anecdotes I want to share. To start with, Bob Day was really the reason that I went to Washington College. When I was looking at colleges, you set these arbitrary criteria to try to narrow things down. And so I had said I wasn't going to look at any schools that had fewer than 1,000 students. And at the time, WAC was really tiny. It was 900 when I was applying. This was in 93 and 94. And so I had tossed the materials in the recycling bin and figured I was going to move on and look somewhere else. And then I got a form letter from Bob Day that he had written and that they were sending out to students. And I don't know how they figured out that I was interested in the literary arts, but it talked about everything he had built there: the lit house, the visiting writers, the money for student publications, the print house with Mike. and Print Shop with Mike, and it sold me. I took the materials back out of the recycling, and long story short, I ended up there enjoying all those things that he had started off, and they were all formative in my, not only my college career, but my just life afterwards. I later got a master's degree in creative nonfiction. I'm an editor now. I run an association magazine. So if it was not for that form letter, I may have ended up on a very different path. But I was also, Roy, encouraged not to follow poetry. We were in a writing workshop, and this was devastating to me at the time. My skin's a little tougher now, but he held up one of my poems and crossed out, he had showed everybody in the writing workshop, he had crossed out the last stanza entirely. And he said, see this, showing it to everybody in the workshop, do this. And it just broke my heart. I was very sensitive. But, sure enough, poetry was not really the way for me to go. But, that kind of tough love approach served me well eventually after I got over it. When he retired, we planned a retirement party for him, and I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but I remember that I think we gave out postcards with Bobisms, and the main one that I remember still, one of his famous quotes from our classes, and I'm terrible at impressions, but we were reading Rip Van Winkle, and his quote was, "It's every man's dream to wake up and find his bitch wife dead." So that was the Bobism that I remember from the postcards. And then finally, later, he gave me and my roommate our first paid jobs in the publishing world. He paid us to go on a book sales tour for the Literary House Press books all over the Eastern Shore just after we had graduated my last summer. And he put a lot of trust in us that I didn't even have in myself at the time. So I really appreciated that. And that was my first paid publishing gig. So there were a lot of just small moments that seemed small at the time, but that were really formative in my life later on going forward.
That is a wonderful string of anecdotes, Eva. Thank you so much. Yeah, that you mentioned your first job in publishing being at the Lit House. There are, as most of you, perhaps all of you know, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of former students who can say that, because the Lit House is one of the only undergraduate institutions in the country where every job on every student publication is paid minimum wage. I mean, we don't go crazy, but they're all paid. It's not clubs like it is in other places. It's not just for fun. It's a job. And one of the other hats that I wear is as the chair of the Board of Publications. And all that means is when they run out of money, I go and find them more money. I find someone who will give me money to do this, or someone who's not paying attention to how much money they have, and I steal a little, or I shift it around from one pot to another, anything to make sure that we can keep giving these students a sense of themselves as professionals in the publishing industry from day one. It's a truly remarkable thing, something we're really proud of. Thank you, Eva, for sharing those stories. Next up is Sandy Hortal. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
You were close enough.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, if you hear snoring, it's the dog, and soon she will be barking, because the only thing she likes worse than me talking to the inanimate computer is when it talks back. So I just thought I'd put that in. Bob Day was a wonderful mentor to me, and he taught me how to teach, and he taught me how to interact with writers and all of that. But one of the main things that he did for me was keep me in college. And my father, I'm a first generation college student, and my father had no use at all for some fancy pants little liberal arts college on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So what that meant was that I was kind of on my own when it came to figuring out how to pay for things. And of course, I was still on his tax returns, and so I wasn't getting, whatever. Anyway, I went to the bookstore that first freshman year. And in those days, you'd hand them your schedule and they'd come back and they'd hand you the books. And so they came back and they said, well, here's this and here's that, here's the other. And I had my little pile of books. And then she said, wait. And she came back and she said, well, here are 13 books for Bob Day's class. The other 5 have been back ordered. I just said, oh, I can't do this. I can't do it. So I went to the library, and a lot of them were the collections of poetry, different collections of poetry. So I got them from the library, and I showed up in class the first day, and he came around and he looked and he saw that I had like 6 library books, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, and he said, a writer should have books. And I said, well, and so the next class, as it turns out, no offense to my father, but he refused to pay the tuition, so I got kicked out of all my classes. So I showed up anyway, and he said, why are you not in my class? And I sort of explained the thing, and he said, are you kicked out of all your classes? And I said, well, yeah, sort of. And he said, don't worry about that. And then he said, and don't worry about the bookstore. I've written them a note, and they've charged all of your books to my account. And when you get the money, you can pay me, you'll take care of it. And I'll go ahead and talk to who are your other professors. And I scribbled down this list, and he did. And then he called my father, which was quite a move. I'm 18 years old. And he said, sir, I'm only going to tell you one sentence. You're embarrassing her. And that was all he needed to say. So I guess what I want to say is now I work at a little podunk community college in East Tennessee, where 80% of my students are first generation college students, and none of them can afford their textbooks. And I still, however many 40 years later, I take my cues from Bob Day, and I help them as I can help them, and I call their parents when it's time to call their parents. And I just wanted to say that about him, because I know that there were lots and lots of students who had similar kinds of experiences with him. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Sandy, that is a version of Bob that we hadn't seen come out. I think many of us saw it in real life. But someone in the chat said that it gave them chills. I felt the same thing. That was really, really extraordinary. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Next up, Frankie Rollins.
Unmuting. The muting. I'm so touched by all these stories, and the more I sit here, the more I'm like, damn, Bob Day made me. He made so much of who I am as a teacher and a writer. And just, Sandy, that touching story just reminded me of this thing where he was my comps advisor. I should have written a thesis, but for whatever reason, I didn't. I was from a very fucked up childhood family situation, and when I got to college, I didn't even know how to do the things. I just didn't. It was all a surprise. And I became I was his assistant, like with Denise. When Denise was Mike's assistant, I was Bob Day's, and he would talk to me, and we'd talk about books, and mostly what I did is move stuff around in his office for him, rearrange, and then get free books and stuff. It was really sweet. But the thing is that for my comps, he started assigning me books to read. And one day I was just reading them and studying them and loving it. And then I would go in and he would just, put his feet up on the desk and ask me like 3 questions. And I would go on and on and on. And that was, his way of teaching. And all of a sudden I realized he's choosing all of these books about fucked up family dynamics, essentially. And I had never said anything specifically to him, but he showed me that what I felt like was sort of my ruination was actually my gift of understanding, that I knew such things and I could speak eloquently on such things in my writing. And it was such a profound moment for me as a writer, but also it's how I teach now, as I look for the things that the people are struggling with and help them find that as their writing, tools, or their writing content, or their technique or form, or whatever it is. And it's so beautiful. But also, like, he also helped me. I one summer, he was like, "What are you doing this summer?" And I was like, I don't know. Last year I had a construction job. And he was like, "That is not going to do." And so he's like, "I'm going to call my old friend Walton Beecham up in DC." And he got me an internship all summer with this publishing company where I made these friends. And it was an amazing, of course, experience, where I also learned I'm not very good in an office setting. But he would just constantly show up, and in those small ways. It wasn't like he wasn't trying to be a savior. He just understood certain absences or lacks that you had, and then he would step in and graciously fulfill them. And I'm verklempt. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Frankie. That's an amazing story, and the fact that he pulled an internship out of his hat, we'll say, makes me happy. It makes me think that we're on the right track with the Light of Day program, building out something that was always in his heart. Thank you, Frankie, for that story. Okay, I see an actual hand up. Eva Gwendolyn Lehman. Go ahead. You can turn your mic on there.
Yeah, okay.
There we are.
I don't even know if I have a hand thing on my computer. I have a little iMac Air thing. So I was not an undergraduate at Washington College. I was in graduate school there, but I actually first met Bob when he was a visiting professor at Salisbury University one summer. And he was teaching an American literature course. And the most memorable class day was the day he brought in a copy of a novel by Fenimore Cooper and walked down the rows, tearing a page of the book out and handing it to each one of us in the class. And each page had a hole in the middle. And when he finished giving us each a page from the book, he went to the front of the classroom and said, "I am so goddamn tired of reading Fenimore Cooper. I took my book out behind my house and shot a hole in it last night. I'll never teach this book again." And following that particular course, I needed to get my master's in English, and I was unable to do that at Salisbury because they didn't offer one at the time. And he talked me into becoming a graduate student at Washington College, where I entered his creative writing graduate program for 2 years before graduating with an MA in English. Quite a memorable character, a charismatic professor, certainly, who loved to tell you, read or recite for you the first lines of novels that were his favorite first lines. And it was Bob that introduced me to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work, and the only person I could think of to call when Marquez won a Nobel Prize and when he died, because I couldn't think of anybody else that would be that interested in mourning with me. But he had a big impact on my life and career as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, before there was Dead Poets Society, there was Bob Day.
Yeah.
Tearing pages out of books. Beautiful. That's wonderful. All right. It might just be that I need new glasses. Oh, there's another hand. Doug Rose, carry on.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you. I know so many of you, and I have many of your emails, whether I know you or not, because I'm really good at, at sort of stalking people on the internet. So I'm just so glad so many of you showed up and you've shared these wonderful stories of Bob Day. I could tell you 100 stories, but I will just tell you one or two. One, I remember when I first came to the college and I was in his freshman writing workshop, and I came in and I thought I was just it. I knew what I was doing. And when it came time to criticize other people's work, I had grammar notes and I just had all this stuff. I was looking for something to read upstairs and I suddenly found all the notes from that workshop and I thought, oh my God, what an ass I was. But he never treated me that way. He never treated anyone that way, and I would watch him talk to students about their work, which I thought was just complete dreck. I thought, how could they even propose reading that? And he would find what was good about it. And he would always talk about what was good about it and what could be brought forth from it. And that's how I learned to teach, but it's also how I learned to critique other people's work. It doesn't do much good to, correct their grammar and their spelling, but it can do a lot of good to sort of look at the meat of what they're working on and help them to grow that. A lot of people have talked about community. I was very fortunate. I was at the college from 81 to 86. I lost a year somewhere along there. And, but I had the great good fortune to live in the literary house when it was at Dorchester House. And I was one of the residents of the literary house that stands now. They only allowed residents for a few years and then the insurance people shut us down. But Paul was there and Sandy was there. And I think there may be one or two others on the list here, but it was so great. What he taught me was community, and that was something that he really stressed in all of his workshops. He's like, writing is a very solitary sort of activity, but you can only get good at it if you're working in community with others. And that's why he just always encouraged us to read things to each other, to publish each other's work, all of that stuff. And that carried over well into my brief but exciting career in publishing, where I had, at one point I had one woman editing books for me and another woman typesetting books for me. One of them or both of them maybe were also residents of the literary house at some point. But I carried the community with me out of college. And it's been wonderful to be able to stay in touch with so many people that I would not have known if Bob Day had not encouraged that kind of interaction, whether it was, poets versus prose writers football or, whatever craziness he came up with. But I think for me, the lasting memory, and this is not the last time I saw him, but probably the most impressive, I guess. My last semester there, I had been working in the library. I'd worked in the library during all the vacations while I was in school because my folks didn't have a lot of money, and that's sort of how I got beer money. But the last semester I was there, I worked there full time, and I completed a second thesis, and I, just got a Sophie Kerr thing together, and it was an important time for me to finish up there. But I can remember as we were coming toward graduation, I was locking up the library and heading back to Literary House so I could get some rest. And suddenly here comes Bob on his bicycle. He comes rolling at me. He said, "Mr. Rose, Mr. Rose." I said, "Yes." I said, "Do you need to get in the library? I have the key." He said, no, I want to talk to you. I said, "Oh, okay. Well, what's going on?" He said, "I want to congratulate you." I said, "Congratulate me for what?" He said, "You've won the Sophie Kerr Prize." And I was so shocked. I stepped my foot on the ground. I said, "Bob Day, it is not nice to tease people. I do not believe you. This is not nice of you to do." And he just chuckled and got on his bike and rolled away into the sunset. I was like, man. I think it's really kind of apocryphal the way he did things altogether. So I'm really, I feel very fortunate that I had the experience of Bob Day in my life. He taught me a lot about how to write and how to read. But more than anything, he taught me how to live, and how to live in community with other creative people. And that's what has stuck with me most over the years. And I can't be more grateful for that. So thank you all for being here tonight. It's so funny. I know some of your names by reputation. I know some of your names because we went to school together. It's very funny, all of that. But I'm glad to see you all. And thank you for coming and allowing me to participate in this event.
Doug, thank you so much. That was a couple of terrific stories. They say a lot about Bob. They say a lot about you. There's a comment in the chat. I won't call your attention to all of them. There are several hundred by now, I think, but Dean Hebert says, a dinner with Doug Rose when I was a prospective student was the reason I chose Washington College, which is a really, really beautiful illustration of that sort of spill-on effect that Bob Day had on a lot of us, right? Sandy's story as well. We became better people and can pay forward some of the things that that Bob did for us. That's a wonderful facet of his legacy as well. Thank you for those stories. Next up is Marjorie White. Not sure where. Oh, Marjorie, if you could turn your mic on. There we go. Nope, not yet. Oh, there you go.
Okay, I don't know what happened. I knew Bob in a different way. I knew him through my best friend, Maureen Jacoby, who moved to Chestertown to a retirement community and knew that she needed to keep her mind going. So she signed up for a course with Bob. And that became a very strong friendship between Bob and Kathy and Maureen. And I got pulled into it. And I want to share with you something that did not connect with Literary House, except to remind you that Maureen Jacoby helped endow some of the Literary House activities there. But as you know, somebody mentioned that Bob and Kathy had a little cottage on an estate of Montaigne in France. And Maureen and I visited them once. It was a tiny little thing, and Kathy produced these wonderful meals on a 2-burner stove. And then each day we would get in this tiny little car with Maureen and me in the back and Bob and Kathy in the front. And Bob entertained us all the way on every little road he could find as we went around. And my most memory of this is Bob created a god. He called him, I can't remember, it's Bendid or something like that. Anyway, that was the name of this new god that Bob created. And throughout the whole trip, he was adding different parts to this religion of this new god that he had. All of it's very, very funny. Maureen and I in the back seat giggling the whole time. And so that was my main memory of riding around with him in France. And I saw him several other times too up there, and I'm still in touch with Kathy, and we miss Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, we absolutely do. Thank you so much, Marjorie, for sharing that. Yeah, Maureen Jacoby has funded a number of things at the Lit House. We've been very grateful for for her gifts over the years. They continue to give. Students continue to benefit from the gift that she gave the Lit House. Thank you so much for sharing that. I am not seeing any other hands up. Let me check the chat really quick. You are welcome to let me know there if you'd like to speak. I'm not seeing anything, but I do see another hand up. Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I was having some trouble with the unmuting, but yeah, I just had a couple of just kind of funny stories about Bob from when I was at Washington College. One was my senior year. I took his modern poetry class, which was a just brilliant, great experience. But one day, and I don't even remember why, but one of my really good friends and I decided to skip the class. And we went off and did whatever we were doing because it was a late afternoon class. We just said, oh, well, we're just going to skip one time. And then we came into class the next class and found out that he had assigned everyone to memorize one of the verses of Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. So because of Bob Day, I will always remember the one section in that poem, a man, a woman, and a blackbird. So that was one. Another was that same friend and I ended up house sitting for him. And I just have this wonderful memory of us taking Amos out on the lacrosse field and having him pick up the balls and just the way Bob Day had told us about the way he did it. And it was just a wonderful experience to actually stay in his house for a week then and be caretakers of it. Thank you.
That's a wonderful story, Lisa. Thank you very much. Yeah, 13 ways, that poem was foundational for many of us, I think, and we got to it and other Wallace Stevens through Bob Day. What a wonderful tribute to his ability to share the best of what has come before in the hopes of making us better than we are. That's something he did all the time. I want to pause very briefly because there is some absolute gold in the chat. I see some of you making constant use of it, and others perhaps not seeing what's going on there. Eva sharing that she stole the broadside idea from Bob Day and used it with her students, publishing a lot of their writing in that form. The broadsides are absolutely core to the identity of the Lit House and of Washington College and of the creative writing program, of the reading series that we have, and the people who come to visit. They are this little bit of sort of graphic art, right? Words made into literal graphic art. They are an identifier for the Lit House, for the college, for the creative writing program, and his role and Mike's role in making those possible. We had to pause them briefly during the pandemic, the first year and a half or so of the pandemic. We couldn't take groups down into the print shop because it's so snug down there, but we are firing the broadside series back up, and I absolutely can't wait. One of my favorite possessions of all is a broadside that they did for me when I came to read my second book, I think. Very grateful for that. I also wanted to read a quick message that we got from Janet Harvey. It's there in the chat, but I'm not sure if everyone can see it. Janet says, I'm signing in from London and it's 2 a.m. here, but I wanted to stick my head in, reflecting that I would probably not be here at all if Bob Day hadn't encouraged me to come and given me a letter of introduction to my first editor in London 35 years ago, along with, I think, $10 to buy her a bottle of wine. I'm noticing the bottle of wine trope coming up again and again with Bob. That's probably just a coincidence. The message ends, thank you, Bob. Love to see everyone here and hear all the remembrances. XOXO. Thank you, Janet, for that message. All right, we've got another hand up. Brandon Hopkins, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to say, I think a lot of people have said, but it's really lovely to hear all of these remembrances from across the many years of Bob's career. I especially like hearing the very early days, those stories. And I used to love hearing Bob's early days stories of like visiting writers and, you know, James Dickey running down the street naked and that kind of thing. So this is just kind of it feels like a continuation of that. And so, yeah, I just, many people have already said this, but I mean, I remember meeting Bob at the Perspectives weekend and really finding him to be kind of like the writer's writer, you know, and he was definitely, he and Bennett Lamond, who we've also lost, and God bless him. The two of them together really convinced me to go to Washington College. And I remember we just had a great Perspective weekend, and Nawal El-Sadawi was the speaker that weekend. And I remember Bob leading that whole, presenting her and leading that event. And then we did a poetry analysis and everything like that. But the thing that I remember, it sort of got later in the day, and at some point we ended up, everybody had submitted their work to kind of be considered. And I remember feeling very kind of, like, oh, this is the first time my writing has ever been judged by anyone, or I've been in any kind of situation like this. And I just remember him opening the workshop, the little mini workshop we did. And it was like I said, it was like late in the afternoon. So I think there had been some wine involved, and Bob was a little loose. And he just came in and he was like, look, I don't care about your fucking philosophy of life. I want to see your craft. And that was his whole approach to that entire thing. And that really stuck with me. And a couple of other memories that I remember in a workshop when I actually was in one of his classes. He had this whole idea of judging a character by whether you would be able to stand being stuck in a car with them for an hour. And that could have worked many ways. I mean, that character could have been, a total jerk or something, but were they interesting enough for that hour in the car to be worthwhile? And I thought that's a pretty great criterion for judgment. Another thing, somebody mentioned him sort of just slashing poetry apart in workshops. And I used to love that because he was always right. I always remember him saying like, no, you need to break your line here. And later I ended up working in publishing a bit and doing like book covers and stuff, and having to I was more sort of proofreading them, but I always say, no. You don't break the line there. You don't break that bit of text there. You break it where Bob would break it, right here. And he taught me this sort of, it was almost like a visual, the visual language of text, and that trickled down to, the experience that many of us got to have with the press, and of having to not just think of your writing as, a message to other people, but also just an experience that people have on a page. So I was really, really grateful to have that experience of, oh, I wrote this poem that's, 55 lines long. Well, now I have to set it. Maybe it's 44 lines long, actually, now, because, with those little pieces of lead. And one of my favorite Bob Day stories or classic experiences was that it was a really rainy day in Bill Smith. And he kind of came in and he just looked around the room and he could read the room, and nobody wanted to be there that day. And he said, you know what? I'm going to go home. I'm going to run a bath. I'm going to have a glass of whiskey. Have a good day. And he just walked out. So he was a great teacher, and I'm really touched to hear all of your stories. And it's really been a wonderful evening to connect with this community again. So thank you all.
Brandon, thank you very much for those stories. I mentioned the bottle of wine as a trope. I'm also noticing walking into a classroom, saying one thing and then canceling class. I'm noticing that as a trope as well. That does seem to be showing up here and there. But only an artist, only a classroom artist knows when to safely deploy that move, right? You can't go to that well too often, or it runs dry. Those are great stories, Brandon. Thank you. Next up, we have Marge Falal. Possibly. Marge.
Okay, I got the thing on mute. Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
There you go. Take it away.
Okay. I couldn't find the right thing to click for the hand here, but I guess I got it, or somebody got it. Yeah, I wanted to say that this has been very interesting to hear all this from the student and then writer point of view. I had a rather different experience with Bob since 1970. My husband and I came to, I didn't come to Washington College. My husband, Bob Fallaw, did in the history department in 1970. And Bob was among the other new additions that year, new president, something like 18 new faculty members. It was quite interesting, especially the new president part, Charles Merdinger. Some people may remember him. And I certainly didn't have any exposure to what Bob did in the classroom. However, Bob Day and my Bob were frequenters, shall we say, of the faculty lounge that was in Bill Smith. I don't know, they must have had similar periods off or something like that. And it was sort of the liar's bench in a way. But my husband would often come home with some new tale of Bob Day's, whether it was true or not, good question. But I think the two of them spent a lot of time laughing together with whoever else was in there and participating. And what I did was peripheral. I had two little kids at the time and then two more later on. I typed for Bob. I typed the last cattle drive that went off to the publisher on the Selectric, which got passed back and forth. In fact, I have it now after a more advanced, I bought it for El Cheapo, after a more advanced version came out, or I can't remember exactly if it was computers that came next, and I don't know who bought that Selectric, if it was AWP, which didn't exactly have a lot of money either, or if it was Sophie Kerr money or, the college or whatever it was. But Bob used that during the day often. And I usually worked at night. So I would pick it up. He would bring it over, this Selectric was going back and forth. Unfortunately, it was not the later edition of Selectrics. It was not the kind where you could correct what it was called, a correcting Selectric. It was still an old style typewriter, but it was a good, fast kind of acting sort of thing. And then I guess the last time, off and on, I typed this or that for him and sort of lightly edited it, but I didn't want to do anything to his voice. So I was extremely careful and, made a note of everything I had suggested or substituted very slightly. And I think it was about 2016 was the last time I saw him. He was here from Kansas, I guess. Oh, well, we did some of this over the internet. I think he had to go to Lou Dell to use the internet at first without, leaving. He had to leave home and there was no internet working where he was. And I just didn't see him since. He asked me maybe a year later to do something else for him. What I did, I think, was a collection of short stories. And I can't remember what the next thing was, but that may be the last thing he got published. I'm not sure. One of the stories, of course, that is not related to his writing class or his teaching or his students was in the early years of the 70s, there was a faculty basketball team for intramural competition, various fraternities and groups and whatever. This was a men's faculty team, no women on it. So the two of them also had become a little overweight. And there was a competition by a certain date to see who would lose the most weight. I can't remember if they set a weight they were aiming for or it was how many pounds that they were going to have a weigh off or a weigh in. And one time my husband came home with this big box, not a tall box, but probably 12 inches to 15 inches square. He raised the lid. He said, "This is what Bob Day delivered to me today." It was originally probably a very puffy glazed donut that he had gotten from Amity Bakery across the street from the college, the Bloomers, Ronnie Bloomer, and what was his wife's name? Anyway, they eventually came to work for the college bakery doing the morning goodies and so on. But at the time they had their own bakery across from the college. Oh, it used to be an OBGYN house, a doctor's house or business now. And he had special ordered this thing. I can't imagine what they thought there when they took this order for the biggest possible donut that they could produce to tempt my husband to eat it and gain weight. And I can't actually remember who won the contest. All I remember is the donut, but it was kind of typical what he would do. So have you all been around the James Dickey thing? I couldn't watch the first 20 minutes because when I tried to sign in to Zoom, it said, your version is outdated, you must update. So I had to fiddle with figuring out how to update, retrieve my password for, the whole thing. Have people discussed the James Dickey event, which was probably 1972, I guess, when he came to the college? Because other people probably remember different aspects. I remember certain, in fact, I sort of laughed to myself half the day today about it as I kept visualizing. I could, see some of what went on. I know where I was sitting, where I was doing, and so on. Did that go on in the first 20, 25 minutes?
We did have one brief mention of it, but frankly, we could deal with more.
Okay, well, okay. My husband and I intended to go. We did. It may have started at something like 8 o'clock or 7. No, probably 8. It was held in Hinson Lounge. There was a good crowd there when we came. And we probably got there 10, 15 minutes early, if that. About the only place to sit that was left where we would be, up close, was next to the still rather new college president, Charles Merdinger, and his wife. And by that time, of course, Charles Merdinger was already rather controversial with both students and faculty, and increasingly so with the board. And then he only stayed 3 years total. This would have been maybe in his 3rd year already. Can't remember. Okay, and we waited and we waited and we waited. The appointed hour came for it to start, and we learned early on that nothing ever starts on time in Chestertown, at least back then. Everything starts late, from musical performances to lectures, you name it. It was always a so-called fashionable 10 or 15 minutes late even. So everybody was restive. The president next to me and his wife, and my husband on my other side, everybody was getting restive, like, where is he? Where is he? And there was, I guess, what you would call a commotion heard down the stairs at the back of Hinson Lounge. And lo and behold, here he comes. And I find out later, I didn't see this, he was essentially being propped up by probably mostly entirely male members of the English faculty, because he had been with too much liquor. But they got him propelled down the aisle. We could tell it was a little strange walk, but he walked rather resolutely to the front. The accompaniers stayed in the back, standing up, I guess, at the ready in case they had to do something, like if he fell down. And he had I won't call it a cowboy hat, I don't know what kind it was, a big brimmed thing with flat brim and little bells on it, on the brim all the way around. And so he jingled when he walked. And I don't think he ever took the hat off, not in there. So he jingled to the lectern and began to read, or more or less did, and stops within, I guess, 10 minutes. Couldn't have been much longer if it was. Might have been a little shorter. He read something that I don't remember what it was. It was a poem, and looks at his watch and says, "Oh, I see. I better wind up now." I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. I see. I've been talking for for over an hour. It's time to go or something like that. And he sets out for the door or wherever he went. Bob Day's first wife, Virginia, and I paid a call to the ladies' room that was adjacent, maybe still is, to Henson Lounge, because we were going to go to the after party. And we get in there and she goes into one stall and I go into another. And we're talking back and forth about what had just occurred in this very shortened reading. And somebody came in, we couldn't see anything. We're talking back and forth. And then this voice, kind of outraged, pipes up and says, "You just don't understand Jim." And it's the girlfriend who's gone on tour with him, I guess. She may have been a student at the University of South Carolina, since I think that's where he was teaching at least some of the time during this particular period. And there we were, we didn't really want to encounter her. We stayed in the stalls and finally went out, and that's who it was. So everybody proceeded to the Newland's house, Nick Newland, on Washington Avenue. He was chair of the English department at the time, wouldn't retire for maybe another year or two. And it's the house on Washington Avenue is, to all appearances, early 20th century, late 19th, just up a little from the phone company building on that side of the street. And they had added a big addition to the rear of the house that was modern architecture. And in later years, the Chester River Society of Friends bought that back part and had it moved out of the lot, I guess, of the front part of the house toward Philosopher's Terrace. If you've driven by there, you can still see it. It may be attached again, I don't know. This is a big kind of common room with high ceiling, very, very interesting, with a kitchen back there and so on. But anyway, we went in the front door, not the back door, the part where we were going to be. And he had gotten there already, I'm pretty sure, and plopped himself down on a sofa where there was the wife of a new economics faculty member. And she was basically sort of trapped. I don't know where the girlfriend was. I didn't see her after that. And he was hitting on her, and he didn't stay there terribly long, as I recall. Everybody got something to drink at sort of a bar table on the way back from the old house to the new house. And he fairly abruptly, just got up to leave. And a lot of people left at that point. And we went through the way we'd come in, past the bar table. And he never even broke his stride. He wasn't still walking too well, but he made one swoop with his right arm and grabbed a new expensive unopened bottle of scotch, I think is what it was, and took it along. And Nick Newland is standing there, the host, trying to keep a poker face, probably. We were amazed. We almost started to laugh on the spot. But so everybody goes home. The next day, somebody was saying something about naked in the street. I don't know if he was naked in the street, but my husband came home with what Bob had told him, probably in the faculty lounge or maybe over lunch, that the housekeeper for the alumni house, and the alumni house was the only place that the college had a facility to put up visiting people up on the third floor, essentially the attic. The lower parts were offices. And I believe the housekeeper there was the same one as who cleaned GI Hall, where, well, let's see, it was Daly Hall, anyway, on that location. And she had apparently come into work that morning in that building and came screeching down, "There's a naked man up here and there's a sea of bottles." and reported this fact and wouldn't go back up. And then the next chair of the English department, I guess, was Nancy Tatum, who knew that James Dickey was going to go to some school in Kansas or Oklahoma afterwards. Whoa, lost the picture. And what she did was to call ahead because she had a friend teaching there and warn them not to give him booze. And I guess Bob Day probably learned a few lessons along those lines too. You're there, okay. So that's my memory of that, and possibly other people might remember other things. And I guess he did something when he was here. I don't know what it was. He was supposed to work with individual students or small groups of students, you know, the usual thing for a several-day visit. And somebody has written, maybe it was Jim Doucette, about, Mary Wood, yeah, about lunch down in Queen Anne's County, but I had nothing to do with that. So that's that's probably the, well, give me 10 minutes, I could think of something else that was funny, but that James Dickey thing just sticks out in my memory, and I can just visualize. Oh, Merdinger, forgot about that. My husband came home with this tale. Bob Day had taken Dickey in to meet the college president, Charles Merdinger, who was a naval officer who basically didn't make admiral. I mean, he was, you know, out at captain. He'd gotten a DPhil, I guess, at Oxford. He'd taught at the Naval Academy in the Department of English, History, and Government, or Politics, Government, I guess they called it. Kind of a funny combination. But what he did was to take the visiting speaker in, naturally, to meet the president, to his office. And this was the first day he was here. Dickey must have already had a fair amount to drink, I don't know. And he said, right as they were leaving, but in plain earshot of the president, something like, he's a regular wooden Indian, ain't he? And that was in the introduction that Merdinger had to him. So there they are sitting next to me and my husband on my other side at this event, non-event. After Dickey exited, Merdinger leans over and says to my husband, "How much are we paying him anyway?" And my husband said, "Well, I don't know," which he didn't know. He didn't have anything to do with engaging him. And then he volunteered that, well, next time we want to get a poet, we ought to get John Ciardi. He comes free to the Naval Academy. Actually, he didn't go free to many places, maybe to the Naval Academy because of his own World War II service, but he made more of his money on the lecture circuit at one period of his life than he did, you know, teaching, a regular appointment. And I never heard if Bob Day and Merdinger had any conversation about this, but might have happened, might not. So I'll quit there.
Marge, that was delightful. Thank you very, very much. I've had several thoughts along the way, and they sort of came and went. But I will say that I knew and remember well your Bob as well. I had him for a history class. I still remember the cigarillos, if I have that right, that he smoked in class, because back then you still could. And I remember his teaching us notions of history and enjoying sharing with us Ford's notions of history, which I'm not even going to tell you all. You had to be there. You had to remember it. You had to earn it. You had to be in Bob Flaw's class and earn that notion. Thank you so much, Marge. That was terrific.
Well, a lot of
Um,
people went through Washington College taking his classes at one point or another, and no, he did not go out a window of Bill Smith Hall. That was a urban legend.
But not a bad one. Not a bad one. We should all be so lucky to have stories like that told about us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marge. Looking around, not sure if I see any other hands up. Does anyone want to, of course, it'll have to be better than the Dickey story. That's where the bar has been set.
There are probably other aspects I have no idea about.
Would anyone else like to chip in? We're getting toward the end of this event, which will certainly not be the end of stories told about Bob Day. Anyone like to chip in with one more?
I was just asking if anyone knew the story of the students crashing the car, Bob Day's car at one point. If anyone is willing to take responsibility or heard that one. Some students stole his car at one point and crashed it, but that's about all I can remember. I think they were drunk.
I'm willing to bet that's true. That's not a story I've heard before.
I remember taking it. It was a campus station wagon. I don't think it was Day's car, but we drove to Washington to pick up. Maybe actually it was Newark, the airport, to pick up Ginsberg, and we went through all these crazy things, and going through all these dangerous looking neighborhoods and stuff. But we pulled up right up on the grass in front of Richmond House, and we ran out of gas right there. And something like Ginsberg said, "Oh, this is door-to-door service."
Lovely. Lovely, yeah. For some reason, just from all these other stories, I'm going to go ahead and guess that it maybe wasn't just one car, that maybe there were, I don't know, multiple stories over multiple years or multiple cars in a single incident. I'm not sure exactly what the case would have been. I would like to thank all of you so much for sharing these stories of Bob Day. He was an absolutely remarkable storyteller, a remarkable human being, a remarkable author, and he built a program that I am very, very, very happy to be a part of. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you. I will now hand things over to my boss, the estimable Dr. James Allen Hall, who's been with us for most of the evening, to tell you a little bit more about the Light of Day program that we are putting together to continue Bob's legacy of sending students out into the world ready for it. Thank you very, very much. James.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm sorry I was late. I teach tonight, and I'm the one who scheduled this event. So I think I, like Bob, could bend space and time, I guess. But I ended a little early so I could be with you guys, and I'm really glad I did. And my students are probably very, very glad that I did. One of the things that I learned when Bob passed was that we share the same birth date. We're both born on October 16th, which makes us Libras. And that made me feel like I'm doing the kind of work that I'm meant to do. And I will just say I'm every day grateful to go to work in the Lit House. It's the weirdest. I still, to this day, I've been directing since 2016. I still notice, new things about the house or a broadside, or wow, that person came. And it is a living entity made by Bob, and it still impacts students every day, and it will continue to do that. Bob's legacy is that house, and his teaching. He lives on, like what Yates said about Auden, right? He's become his books and his admirers. So we'll make sure that the admirers keep going. And one of the things I keep hearing about Bob is that he was just an unrhymable person. He just was no other person like him, which made other people feel like they could be their true, authentic, idiosyncratic selves. And we want to just keep that going, make sure that students can get out into the world with an edge, that when they graduate from Washington College, they can get jobs in editing, publishing, writing. They can follow their passions. And we want to make sure that that legacy that Bob started at Washington College of connecting students with their lives and their selves continues. So that's why we're starting an endowment to fund student internships. We hope that we can award those first internships in next academic year. We're starting to pilot that program. We've already got a bunch of partners, national literary organizations that want our fabulous students. And so we'll pair writers and national organizations together so that they can benefit from each other. And then when our students graduate, they can say, I've had this experience. I've already broken into this life. And then, so that's the light of day. I will mail some more information about that to you. But I really just want to, at the end, raise a glass to Bob. And I hope if you have something near, it is of the hour, I think. This is a little bit of whiskey. I think Bob and I were a lot alike in some ways. Anyway, so here's to Bob. And here's to all of you too. I think Bob probably would have shot it. I can't do that. But anyway, thank you all again. This has been really delightful, moving. I've known so many of you in person and just electronically too. Doug, we have to stop meeting like this at memorials, and but thank you all for coming, for putting us all in touch together. I'm sorry if there are people I hadn't gotten in touch with that should have been here tonight, but we'll post this on YouTube. We'll send you all the link, and folks can comment there so that their stories and reminiscences of Bob can also live on in this event. Okay. Thank you all for making so much time for Bob and for the Lit House.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Good to see you all too. Good night. Good writing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see everyone.
I record it to the cloud. I need to stop it.